A routine police patrol takes a shocking turn when an officer makes a split-second mistake, using pepper spray on a canine German Shepherd, Alfredo, without realizing he is a decorated service dog. But when his blind owner, a retired ex-captain, steps forward, the truth shakes the entire community. The incident goes viral, the officer is suspended, and a battle for justice begins. What happens when a hero dog suffers at the hands of those meant to protect him? Stay with us as we uncover this emotional and intense story. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. Now, let's dive into this incredible journey. The streets of downtown Portland were soaked from an earlier drizzle, the neon lights from the storefronts reflecting in the puddles on the pavement. Officer Darren Calloway had been on patrol for nearly 12 hours, exhaustion gnawing at his focus. His radio crackled, another disturbance call. Possible aggressive dog outside a local cafe, requesting immediate response. Darren exhaled heavily and turned the wheel. He had handled loose dogs before, usually strays causing a scene. But something about this call unsettled him. When he arrived at the cafe, a small crowd had gathered, their murmurs blending with the sound of distant car horns. Darren's eyes locked onto the source of the commotion, a large canine German Shepherd standing firm in front of a man sitting on a nearby bench. The dog was tense, alert, ears perked up, muscles rigid. His amber eyes didn't waver as he remained protectively in front of his owner. A few people in the crowd took cautious steps back. The blind man, dressed in a simple dark jacket, gripped the dog's harness, his face unreadable behind a pair of black sunglasses. Darren's instincts kicked in. That dog's dangerous. He stepped forward, hand gripping the pepper spray clipped to his belt. "Sir, you need to control your dog," Darren barked, his tone sharp. A few bystanders murmured, shaking their heads. "He's not dangerous," the blind man responded, his voice calm but firm. "He's my service dog. His name is Alfredo. He's highly trained." Darren's pulse spiked. He had been trained to assess threats, and this dog, this huge German Shepherd, was staring him down, refusing to move. He couldn't take the chance. With one swift motion, Darren raised the pepper spray and fired a direct stream into the dog's face. A sharp, agonizing yelp shattered the night air. The massive canine German Shepherd reared back, his powerful frame collapsing onto the pavement as he desperately clawed at his burning eyes. His whimpers were heart-wrenching, his body writhing in pain. The blind man gasped, reaching out, but Alfredo was thrashing on the ground, disoriented and suffering. Then, the crowd erupted. "What the hell did you just do?" a woman screamed. "You idiot! That's Alfredo, the canine service dog of Richard Blake." Darren's blood ran cold. That name, Richard Blake. He wasn't just any blind man. He was a retired police captain, a decorated officer who had lost his sight on duty years ago. And Alfredo? He wasn't some pet. He was a canine hero, a lifeline, a warrior who had saved countless lives. Now, he lay on the wet pavement, suffering, because of Darren's mistake. Phones were already out, recording. The footage would spread like wildfire. Darren knew this wasn't just a bad decision. It was the biggest mistake of his career. The city of Portland woke up in outrage. The video of Alfredo, the canine German Shepherd, writhing in pain after being hit with pepper spray by Officer Darren Calloway, was everywhere. The footage showed the agony of the highly trained service dog, his whimpers weak, his massive paws clawing at his burning eyes, as his blind owner, Richard Blake, frantically reached for him. The crowd's shouts of disbelief echoed in the background. Overnight, the incident exploded on social media. "Officer attacks service dog. Justice for Alfredo." "Blind veteran's canine partner pepper sprayed. Shocking footage. Officer Calloway must be fired. No excuses. News stations picked it up. Every major network ran the story, dissecting every second of the footage. Some reporters called it reckless police brutality. Others said it was an unforgivable mistake. But one thing was clear. Darren Calloway was now the most hated officer in Portland. Inside the Portland Police Department, the atmosphere was tense. Chief Michael Harrington stood in his office, his jaw clenched as he watched the video on his phone for what felt like the 100th time. The sound of Alfredo's pained whimpering made his stomach turn. Seated across from him, Darren Calloway sat rigidly in his chair, his hands clasped together tightly. He hadn't slept. The weight of his mistake pressed down on him like a concrete slab. The chief's voice was dangerously calm. "What the hell were you thinking?" Darren hesitated, his throat dry. "Sir, I thought the dog was aggressive. I thought he was going to attack." Chief Harrington exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "You pepper sprayed a decorated canine service dog, Calloway. A partner. A hero. And you did it in front of a blind man who served this country. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Darren swallowed hard. I panicked, sir. The situation escalated and You didn't listen," the chief interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade. "Richard Blake told you Alfredo wasn't a threat, and you ignored him." Darren lowered his head. He had nothing to say. There was no excuse. Chief Harrington sighed heavily. "The mayor called this morning. The governor too. They want immediate action. The public wants your badge." A knot tightened in Darren's chest. "Am I being fired?" The chief's hard stare lingered for a long moment. "Suspended indefinitely, without pay." Darren winced, his stomach sinking. He had expected it, but hearing it out loud made it real. "That's not all," the chief continued. "There will be a formal investigation, and depending on the findings, you could be terminated permanently. Protests are already forming outside the precinct. This isn't going away." Darren's heart pounded. Protests? The chief turned his phone toward him. Live footage of angry crowds gathered outside the police station filled the screen. People held up signs that read, "Justice for Alfredo." "K9s are heroes, not targets. Fire Calloway now!" Reporters stood in front of the precinct, broadcasting the public outrage to the entire country. Darren felt suffocated. The door to the office suddenly swung open, and Emily Carter, an investigative journalist, stormed in. "This is a PR disaster, Chief," she said, her tone sharp. "The whole country is watching. We need a statement." Chief Harrington nodded, his expression grim. "Calloway will speak at a press conference tomorrow morning. He'll apologize publicly." Darren's chest tightened. "A public apology?" His voice was hoarse. The chief's eyes burned into him. "You owe the people of Portland, and you owe Richard Blake and Alfredo. You're going to stand in front of those cameras and take responsibility." Darren's mind swirled. The world hated him. His career was in jeopardy. And worst of all, he deserved every bit of it. Darren sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the blue light of his phone screen casting eerie shadows across his tired face. His social media accounts had been flooded with hate messages. "You're a disgrace to the badge. How could you attack a K9 hero? I hope you never work in law enforcement again." He clenched his jaw as he scrolled, his chest tightening. Every major news outlet was still talking about him. The video of him spraying Alfredo had reached millions of views. His name and face were plastered across headlines, accompanied by the most damning words possible. "Officer uses excessive force on decorated canine. Public demands justice." His job, his reputation, his entire life was falling apart. A sudden knock on the door made him jolt. He hesitated before standing, dragging himself toward the entrance. When he opened it, his wife, Jessica Calloway, stood there, her expression a mix of exhaustion and sadness. "You haven't answered my calls," she said softly. Darren sighed, running a hand over his unshaven face. "There's nothing to say." Jessica stepped inside, crossing her arms. "The whole world is watching, Darren. Do you even understand how serious this is?" "I know," he muttered, his voice rough. "I screwed up." She let out a deep breath. "They're not just coming after you. People have been calling my work. The kids at school are talking about it. Our entire family is getting dragged into this." Guilt gripped his chest like a vice. He had been so caught up in his own downfall, he hadn't even thought about how it was affecting her. "Jess, A loud buzz from the TV interrupted him. The local news was airing a press conference. He turned to see Richard Blake standing in front of dozens of reporters, with Alfredo at his side. The K9 German Shepherd was wearing protective eye covers, a clear indication of the damage done. Jessica grabbed the remote and turned up the volume. "I trained Alfredo to trust police officers," Richard said, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. "He was my partner long before I lost my sight, and he has saved more lives than I can count. What happened to him was unacceptable." Murmurs rippled through the crowd of journalists. One reporter stepped forward. "Do you think Officer Calloway should be fired?" A long pause. The tension in the room thickened. Richard's sightless eyes remained forward. "I think he needs to face real consequences. What message are we sending if we allow officers to act on impulse and fear?" Alfredo was not a threat, but he was treated like one. That cannot be ignored. Darren swallowed hard. He felt like he had just been punched in the gut. Jessica shook her head. "You have to fix this, Darren." He let out a bitter chuckle. "How? The world already made up its mind. They want me gone." Jessica met his gaze, her eyes fierce. "Then prove them wrong." Before Darren could respond, his phone buzzed again. It was from Chief Harrington. Tomorrow morning was the press conference, his last chance. And if he failed, he would never wear a badge again. The morning air was crisp and cold, a stark contrast to the firestorm raging around Darren Calloway. He stood behind the heavy doors of Portland Police Headquarters, his stomach a tight knot of nerves. Outside, a crowd had gathered, their chants growing louder by the minute. "Justice for Alfredo! Fire Calloway! Now! Canines are heroes, not targets." The press conference was set to begin in 10 minutes. Darren glanced at the television monitors inside the building, displaying live footage of the angry protesters, their faces filled with outrage and disappointment. His career, his reputation, even his family's name, it was all hanging by a thread. Chief Michael Harrington strode up beside him, his expression unreadable. "You're about to face the toughest moment of your life, Calloway," he said in a low voice. "Every word you say out there matters. This isn't about saving your job anymore. It's about proving to the world that you understand what you did." Darren nodded stiffly, his throat dry. The door to the press room swung open, and they stepped inside. Bright camera flashes exploded in front of Darren, making him flinch. Reporters filled the small conference room, their microphones extended, their faces eager for a story. At the front row, sitting beside a group of K9 handlers, was Richard Blake. The blind ex-captain sat tall, his jaw set in determination. Beside him, Alfredo, the K9 German Shepherd, sat calmly, though the protective covers over his eyes served as a painful reminder of Darren's mistake. Chief Harrington stepped up to the podium first. He cleared his throat, adjusting the microphone. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "This department understands the seriousness of what happened to K9 Alfredo and his handler, Captain Richard Blake. We also understand the anger and disappointment felt by the community. Officer Calloway will now address this incident directly." Darren took a deep breath and stepped forward. The room fell silent. Hundreds of eyes burned into him. The camera zoomed in, broadcasting his face to the entire country. His chest tightened. But then, he glanced at Alfredo, who remained still, loyal, despite what had happened, and Richard, who waited, expecting accountability. Darren gripped the sides of the podium and spoke. "I want to start by saying something very clear," he began, his voice stronger than he expected. "I was wrong." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I made a split-second decision that I can never take back," he continued. "I let fear and misjudgment cloud my judgment, and because of that, I hurt Alfredo, a hero who has saved lives." Reporters scribbled furiously. The cameras zoomed in closer. Darren turned toward Richard Blake, his gaze steady. "Captain Blake, I can't begin to imagine what I took from you in that moment. I failed to see Alfredo for what he truly is. Your partner, your protector, your friend. I took an oath to serve and protect, and that night, I did the opposite. For that, I am deeply, truly sorry." The room was silent. Even the reporters seemed taken aback by his words. Then, from the front row, Richard Blake slowly stood up. His face was unreadable. Alfredo stirred beside him, his ears twitching at his handler's movement. For a long, painful moment, Richard said nothing. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on. Then, the ex-captain finally spoke. "I appreciate your words, Officer Calloway," he said, his voice measured. "But words mean nothing if they don't come with action." Darren nodded, his jaw tightening. "I agree," he said. "That's why I've already started working with K9 training specialists to understand what I failed to see that night, and I'll be dedicating my time to raising awareness about the importance of K9I units in our communities." Richard considered his words, then gave a small nod. "Then, let's see if you mean it." A few reporters exchanged glances. The atmosphere had shifted. The anger wasn't gone, but there was now a sense of possibility, a chance for redemption. But Darren knew this was just the beginning. The fight to earn back the trust he had lost was far from over. Darren sat on the edge of his bed, his hands clasped tightly as he stared at the floor. The press conference had been over for 2 days, but the weight of his mistake still clung to him like a shadow that refused to leave. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. He hesitated before glancing at the screen. Unknown number. He let it ring, convinced it was just another angry call from someone demanding he resign. But then, the voicemail notification popped up. With a deep breath, he pressed play. "Officer Calloway, this is Captain Richard Blake. I've been thinking about your words at the press conference. If you're serious about learning, meet me tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. at the Portland K9 training facility. Let's see if you really understand what these dogs do." Darren's heart pounded. This was unexpected. And it wasn't just an invitation. It was a test. The next morning, Darren arrived at the training facility before sunrise. The air was crisp, and a thin layer of mist covered the field. He spotted Richard Blake standing near the fence, his posture rigid yet commanding. Beside him, Alfredo sat tall, his ears perked, eyes locked on Darren. Though he couldn't see, Richard seemed to sense Darren's hesitation. "You're on time," Richard noted. "Good." Darren stepped forward, his boots crunching against the damp grass. "I meant what I said. I need to understand." Richard nodded toward the training area, where several K9 officers were running drills with their partners. K9 units aren't just dogs, Calloway. They're officers. They work harder than most humans I know. Alfredo, he's saved my life more times than I can count. Darren swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his ignorance settle deeper in his gut. Richard motioned to a young trainer who approached with a newly recruited K9, a young German shepherd named Axel. "You're going to train with Axel today," Richard said. "You'll see firsthand the discipline, the intelligence, and the trust these dogs require. Darren nodded, stepping closer to Axel, who sniffed him cautiously before sitting, his tail wagging slightly. The trainer handed Darren a padded sleeve, the kind used for bite training. "Let's see if you're ready for some real lessons." Darren slid the protective gear onto his arm, nerves creeping into his chest. Richard's voice was firm. "You need to understand the power and control these dogs have. Alfredo, Axel, and every other K9 out here. They don't attack unless they're told to. They don't act on impulse. They assess the situation." Darren felt the stings of those words. That's what he had failed to do that night with Alfredo. The trainer gave a sharp command, and in a flash, Axel launched forward, sinking his powerful jaws into the sleeve. Darren staggered backward, stunned by the force. Axel held firm, but never applied unnecessary pressure. He wasn't attacking recklessly. He was following orders with precision. When the trainer gave the release command, Axel let go. Immediately, sitting at attention, Darren's breath was heavy. "He's incredible." Richard gave a small nod. "Now imagine if someone mistook him for a threat. Imagine if someone treated him like you treated Alfredo." Darren clenched his jaw, shame creeping up his spine. "I don't expect you to fix what you did overnight," Richard said, "but I do expect you to do better." Darren met Richard's gaze. "Then let me prove it." The ex-captain considered him for a long moment before finally speaking. "Then keep coming back. Learn. And maybe, just maybe, you'll understand what it means to trust a K9. Darren exhaled, nodding. This wasn't forgiveness, but it was a second chance. And he wasn't going to waste it. The following weeks were a test of patience, discipline, and humility. Darren showed up to the Portland K9 training facility. Every morning, learning what he should have known all along, how K9 officers worked, how they read situations, and how human error could cost them everything. It wasn't just about training. It was about earning respect. Richard Blake was relentless. He didn't sugarcoat anything, and he didn't make things easy for Darren. "You want to prove you understand, then listen this time," Richard would say, arms crossed as Darren struggled through exercises with Axel. Alfredo, still recovering from the incident, watched everything. Though he wasn't Darren's partner, the German Shepherd's piercing gaze was enough to remind him of his mistake every single day. One afternoon, after an intense tracking drill, Richard called Darren over. "Take a seat," Richard said, gesturing toward the wooden bench by the field. Darren sat, wiping the sweat from his brow. He had just spent 2 hours working on scent tracking with Axel, learning how K9s could locate missing persons, detect explosives, and even sense medical emergencies. Richard sat beside him, his hands resting on Alfredo's back. "You know," Richard started, his voice calm but firm, "when I lost my sight, Alfredo became my eyes. But he wasn't just leading me. He was protecting me, every second of every day. You saw him that night, standing in front of me. He wasn't just a dog being territorial. He was doing his job." Darren exhaled slowly, nodding. "I see that now." Richard turned his head slightly toward him. "You say that, but do you feel it?" Darren looked down, his fingers clenching his knees. "I do," he said quietly. "I made a mistake that night. A huge one. And if I could take it back, I would." Richard studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. "Then let's test that." Darren frowned as Richard stood and gave a signal. A trainer approached, holding a blindfold. "You want to understand?" Richard asked. "Then trust Alfredo the same way I do." Darren's stomach tightened. The trainer handed him the blindfold, and Darren hesitated before tying it over his eyes. Instantly, everything disappeared. The sunlight, the trees, the trainers in the distance. He was in total darkness. Alfredo will guide you through the course, Richard explained. No sight, no control, just trust. And this time, don't let fear make your choices for you. Darren's pulse quickened as he gripped Alfredo's harness. The German Shepherd stood still, waiting for his cue. Then they moved. At first, Darren was tense, his steps unsure, but Alfredo was steady, guiding him through the uneven ground, avoiding obstacles. Every movement felt deliberate, controlled, safe. For the first time, Darren understood what trust truly meant. By the time he removed the blindfold, his chest ached with something deeper than regret. It was understanding. Richard watched him carefully. Now do you feel it? Darren swallowed hard. Yeah, he whispered. I do. For the first time since the incident, Richard gave a small approving nod. Darren had a long way to go, but maybe, just maybe, he was finally on the right path. A month had passed since Darren had first stepped into the Portland K9 training facility, desperate for a chance to make things right. Now, standing in front of a small crowd of officers, trainers and K9 handlers, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in a long time. Richard Blake stood beside him, arms crossed, Alfredo sitting obediently at his side. The K9 German Shepherd's eyes had fully healed, and he no longer needed the protective covers. It was a symbol of resilience, a sign that recovery was possible, both for Alfredo and for Darren himself. Today, Chief Harrington said, stepping to the front of the group, Officer Darren Calloway completes his training and education in K9 handling. He came here not because he was required to, but because he knew he had to learn. He had to be better. A few murmurs went through the group. Darren straightened his posture, knowing that not everyone had forgiven him yet, and that was okay. Richard took a step forward. A mistake doesn't define a man, he said. How he chooses to fix it, that's what matters. Darren swallowed hard as Richard turned toward him. You took responsibility. You learned, and you listened. He paused. That's why Alfredo and I have agreed to let you be part of something bigger. Darren frowned slightly. What do you mean? Richard glanced at Chief Harrington, who nodded. Portland PD is launching a new K9 awareness program, Harrington explained. It's an initiative to teach officers about K9 units, their importance, and how to interact with them in high-stress situations. Darren's chest tightened. And you want me to be part of it? Richard gave a small nod. No one understands the cost of ignorance more than you do. For a moment, Darren could only stare. A month ago, he had been hated, suspended, humiliated. Now, he was being asked to be an advocate for the very thing he had harmed. He turned to Alfredo, the K9 German Shepherd who had suffered because of him, and knelt down, meeting the dog's gaze. I'll make this right, he murmured, his voice firm. I promise. Alfredo held his stare. Then, after a long pause, he licked Darren's hand. The crowd clapped, but Darren barely heard them. He had come here to redeem himself, and maybe, just maybe, he finally had. Redemption isn't about erasing mistakes. It's about learning from them. Darren Calloway made a choice that night, and he paid the price. But instead of walking away, he faced his failure head-on. Alfredo, the K9 German Shepherd, is a hero. And now, Darren is working to make sure no officer ever repeats his mistake again. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video. K9 heroes like Alfredo deserve to be honored, and it's up to us to spread awareness. What do you think about Darren's redemption? Let us know in the comments. This story is a powerful tale of redemption, accountability, and the bond between K9 officers and their handlers. The initial mistake. The narrative starts with Officer Darren Calloway's critical error, a split-second decision based on fear and ignorance. By pepper spraying Alfredo, a highly trained K9 German Shepherd, Darren not only injures a hero, but also damages the trust between the police force and the community. His actions go viral, leading to public outrage, a career crisis, and deep shame. The fallout and public backlash. The immediate consequences are severe. Darren is suspended, his reputation destroyed, and his family dragged into the controversy. The story captures the modern power of social media, showing how a single mistake in law enforcement can become a national scandal overnight. Richard Blake, Alfredo's blind handler and former police captain, represents justice and integrity, holding Darren accountable without seeking revenge. A path to redemption. Instead of running from his mistake, Darren chooses to learn, a rare but essential step in character transformation. The K9 training sequences highlight how K9 officers are not just animals, but partners and protectors. The blindfold test is a symbolic moment, forcing Darren to experience what Richard feels daily, teaching him true trust. The resolution and growth. Darren's journey isn't about erasing the past, but about proving he can change. Richard's forgiveness isn't given freely, it is earned. The final scene, where Alfredo licks Darren's hand, is a small but deeply emotional gesture, signifying that true redemption is possible. By joining the K9 Awareness Program, Darren not only redeems himself but actively prevents future officers from making the same mistake,